Imagine stepping into a prestigious bank in the heart of downtown Chicago, only to feel an invisible wall rise between you and the people inside. Eyes filled with doubt scanned her from head to toe. The way they scrutinized her ID, the subtle hesitation in their voices, the way security was discreetly called over, it was clear. They believed she didn't belong. But what they failed to realize was that the woman they were so quick to question was not just another customer. She was Victoria Lawson, the very founder and CEO of Lawson Financial Group, the very institution she had built on the pillars of fairness, inclusion, and trust. But in this moment, standing under the cold, questioning gaze of the staff, she found herself wondering, was that trust real, or had it been just a beautifully worded promise on paper? Has anyone ever judged you unfairly simply because of how you looked? Share your story in the comments, because your experience matters. This question had been gnawing at Victoria for months. Whispers had reached her ears, subtle yet persistent, stories of certain customers facing different treatment at some branches. There were no scandals, no viral outrage, just a quiet, unsettling pattern, one she couldn't ignore. Her institution had policies against discrimination, but policies alone weren't enough. Change wasn't written in rule books, it was lived in actions. So today, she wasn't walking into her bank as the CEO. She wasn't the woman whose name graced the company's headquarters. She was just another customer. No designer suit, no signature jewelry, no outward signs of wealth or status, just a pair of well-worn jeans, a simple cardigan, and comfortable sneakers. Her hair was tied back in a no-fuss ponytail, and she slung a faded leather bag over her shoulder. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself before stepping out of her car. She had chosen this branch for a reason, a location she had proudly approved 3 years ago, a neighborhood rich with culture and economic promise, where she had once stood at a grand opening ceremony, shaking hands, cutting the ribbon, and speaking passionately about financial inclusion. She had believed in that mission with every fiber of her being. She had trusted that those values would be upheld by every employee in every interaction with every customer. But time had passed, and the whispers had grown louder. Now she wasn't the CEO delivering an inspiring speech. She wasn't the leader who made headlines for championing fairness. She was just a woman, an ordinary customer walking into her own bank, bracing herself to discover the truth. Would she be treated with the dignity and respect that every customer deserved? Or would she finally experience what so many others had hinted at, but never officially reported? As she reached for the door handle, her eyes caught her reflection in the large glass windows. Unremarkable, unrecognizable. No one would know who she really was. This, this was exactly what she had hoped for. As Victoria stepped inside, a cool rush of air conditioning swept over her, carrying with it the sterile scent of printer ink and freshly sanitized countertops. The quiet hum of the bank surrounded her. Soft conversations, the distant clatter of keyboards, the rustling of paperwork. A few customers were scattered across the waiting area, some filling out forms, others chatting casually with tellers. Everything looked normal. But would it feel normal? Steeling herself, she squared her shoulders and strode toward the counter, ready to find out. The woman behind the desk, a teller in her mid-20s with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, barely acknowledged her presence. No warm greeting, no polite smile, not even the most basic form of customer service. Instead, with an uninterested flick of her wrist, she slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out." Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over the clipboard. The teller's tone was flat, dismissive, devoid of even the smallest attempt at courtesy. It was a kind of indifference that Victoria had spent years trying to erase from the banking industry. So this is what it feels like. She had built Lawson Financial Group on the belief that everyone, regardless of background, income, or appearance, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. But standing there now, under the teller's indifferent gaze, she felt a question tightening in her chest. Had that vision truly reached every corner of her own institution? Had she been too idealistic in thinking she could change an industry that had long thrived on quiet bias and subtle exclusion? Swallowing her irritation, she took the clipboard and began filling in the details. Name, account number, withdrawal amount, $500, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing excessive. A simple request, one she knew should raise no concerns. She had personally approved the withdrawal policies at her bank. She knew exactly what should happen next, so why did she suddenly feel like she was being scrutinized under a microscope? She handed the completed form back, her eyes fixed on the teller. And then, everything changed. The moment the teller's gaze dropped to the document, her entire demeanor shifted. The disinterest in her eyes flickered into something else. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her brows drew together ever so slightly. A hesitation, small but unmistakable. Victoria had seen this before. This wasn't about policies or procedures. This wasn't about security measures or banking regulations. This was about perception, that flicker of doubt, the silent, unspoken question. Does she belong here? Victoria remained still, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. She watched as the teller's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, as if debating whether to proceed at all. And then, after a moment's hesitation, the woman made a quiet decision. She placed the ID back on the counter. She didn't type. She didn't verify. She didn't move forward with the transaction. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She had walked in today expecting to be treated like any other customer. To see firsthand if the murmurs she had heard about her bank had any truth to them. And now, here she was, living the very thing she had worked so hard to prevent. The teller's posture stiffened. Her eyes flicked between Victoria's ID and her face, her lips pursing ever so slightly. Another pause, just a beat too long. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Victoria felt it. This isn't about banking policy. This isn't about security concerns. This is about something deeper. The air around her felt heavier now. The teller hesitated for a moment longer, then grabbed Victoria's ID with careful fingers, her voice barely above a murmur. "I'll be right back." And just like that, she turned and disappeared into the manager's office without another word. Victoria exhaled slowly, a tightness coiling in her chest. She tapped her fingers against the counter, steady, controlled. But underneath that measured rhythm, something simmered. Frustration, maybe even anger. She had walked in expecting fairness, expecting a simple, routine transaction. Instead, she was being forced to confront the very biases she had fought to eliminate. Her gaze swept across the room. A man in a pressed business suit stood near the entrance, chatting easily with a teller. No hesitation, no second glances, just effortless, seamless service. A woman in a floral dress sat comfortably in the waiting area, laughing softly as she exchanged pleasantries with a bank associate. No scrutiny, no barriers, just belonging. And then there was Victoria, standing alone at the counter, waiting. Her eyes flicked toward the frosted glass door of the manager's office. She could only imagine what was happening behind it. Was Todd, the branch manager, questioning the legitimacy of her account? Searching for an excuse to deny her request? Silently affirming the teller's hesitation, reinforcing the quiet assumption that people like her didn't belong here? Or was he simply stalling, hoping she would grow frustrated and walk away? Whatever the case, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a routine delay. This was something far more insidious, and Victoria wasn't going anywhere. She could feel it now, the weight of an unspoken assumption pressing against her, thick and suffocating. This moment had nothing to do with protocol. It had everything to do with perception, and something told her. This was only the beginning. The transaction at the other counter was processed in mere seconds. The man in the tailored suit barely had to lift a finger. No additional questions, no scrutiny, no unnecessary delays. Just efficiency and courtesy, the way banking was supposed to be. Across the lobby, a woman in a floral dress chatted lightly with another teller. Their conversation flowed with effortless familiarity, punctuated by the occasional laugh. The woman handed over a check, and within moments her transaction was moving forward. Smooth, seamless, free of doubt. This was exactly the kind of experience Victoria had envisioned when she built this bank. And yet here she stood, treated like an outsider in the very institution she had created. Minutes passed. The teller who had taken her ID had vanished into the back office, leaving Victoria alone at the counter, waiting. But she wasn't just waiting for her money, she was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. This was never about policy, it was about perception. Finally, the manager emerged. Todd Benson, middle-aged, bald, rimless glasses perched on his nose. He carried himself with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His posture was composed, but there was something in his approach that felt too careful, too rehearsed. A polite mask over a decision he had already made. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his tone neutral but distant. "I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal." Victoria nodded, keeping her voice steady. "That's right. $5,000, my account. My ID." Todd reached for the ID, his fingers grazing over it as though he expected something to be wrong. He held it up to the light, turned it over, examined each corner with an unnecessary level of scrutiny. And then the question, the carefully worded, loaded question. "Is this your first time banking with us?" Victoria's patience wavered, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she kept her expression neutral, her voice smooth. "I've banked here since the branch opened." For a split second, something unreadable flickered across Todd's face. Then slowly, he placed her ID back on the counter. "Unfortunately, we're unable to process this withdrawal at this time." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Todd clasped his hands together, his expression carefully measured. "It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously." There it was, that word. Security, a word often used to justify exclusion. A word that built invisible walls around people like her. A word meant to remind certain customers that they did not belong. Victoria inhaled deeply, grounding herself. Then she met Todd's gaze, her voice unwavering. "Would you be asking these questions if I were a man in a tailored suit?" For the first time, Todd's polished composure cracked. Just a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but she saw it. Then just as quickly, he smoothed it over. "This isn't about appearance," he insisted, voice even. "It's about policy." Victoria arched a brow, letting the silence stretch, daring him to believe his own words. She had spent years crafting the policies of this bank. She knew the rules, and she knew without a doubt that none of them justified what was happening right now. And then, Todd made a mistake, a big one. His hand moved, just slightly, pressing a discreet button beneath the counter. Victoria caught the motion immediately. A few seconds later, the door to the side office swung open. A uniformed security guard stepped out, broad-shouldered, tall, the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside. His face was neutral, but Victoria knew better. Security wasn't called unless someone was deemed a problem. And right now, Todd had decided she was the problem. The guard's voice was firm but professional. "Is there a problem here?" Victoria let the question hang in the air. Then slowly she smiled, a deliberate, knowing smile. "That depends," she said, her voice silk over steel. "Are you here to help me access my money, or just to escort me out?" The guard hesitated. His eyes flicked between her and Todd, as if trying to piece together what had really brought him here. He had been summoned, but he hadn't been given details. That made two of them. Todd stayed silent, but his jaw tightened. The damage was already done. He had escalated this moment, turned a simple transaction into a scene. And now, there was no way to quietly undo it. Victoria felt the weight of the room shift. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. People were watching now, not just stealing quick glances, but openly staring. Conversations had faded. The casual, comfortable hum of the bank had been replaced with hushed murmurs, with the quiet crackle of something uncomfortable unfolding. At the edge of the waiting area, a man subtly pulled out his phone, angling it just enough to capture the moment. A teller near the back shuffled paperwork but was clearly listening. Todd had made a mistake, not just by pressing that button, but by assuming Victoria would back down. She had spent her entire career fighting against barriers, proving herself in boardrooms filled with men who doubted her, shattering ceilings designed to keep her in place. And now, after building a bank from the ground up, she was standing here, being told she didn't belong. But she had never been one to shrink under pressure. If Todd thought intimidation would force her to walk away, he was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She held it up, pressing record. "I just want to document this properly," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "You're refusing to let me access my account despite my valid ID, while other customers are served without issue." Todd tensed. Too late. Victoria placed her ID firmly on the counter. The clack of plastic against marble echoed in the silent room. A few customers exchanged glances, whispered to one another. The security guard hesitated, shifting his weight, uncertainty flickering across his face. At the far end of the room, a teller pretended to be occupied, but Victoria could see her, listening. And then, Victoria straightened. Her voice rang through the bank. "Let me introduce myself properly." A pause. "I am Victoria Lawson, CEO and founder of Lawson Financial Group." She let the words sink in. "And I built this bank." The silence that followed was instantaneous. Todd went pale. The teller, the very one who had made her wait, looked like she wanted to vanish behind the counter. The security guard, the one who had stepped forward with authority just moments ago, now shifted awkwardly on his feet, suddenly unsure of his role in this scene. Victoria let the weight of the moment settle. Let them all feel it. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice smooth but cutting. "If I looked the way you expected a CEO to look, we wouldn't be having this conversation." She slid a business card across the counter, her movements deliberate, controlled. "You'll be calling my office to schedule a meeting with corporate." Then she turned her attention to the teller. "And maybe," she said, voice laced with quiet intensity, "you should ask yourself why protocol only seems to apply to people like me." With that, she straightened, exuding the unshakable confidence that had built an empire. As she walked toward the exit, she made one final declaration, clear, unwavering, leaving no room for misunderstanding. This is the last time something like this happens in my bank." The aftermath was swift. By the next morning, the fallout had begun. An emergency meeting was called. Todd was gone. Corporate HR conducted a formal review, reinforcing company policies against discrimination and implementing stricter oversight measures to ensure no employee, no manager, ever made this mistake again. Bias training was no longer optional, it was mandatory. Accountability policies were restructured from the ground up. The institution, once complacent in its unspoken biases, was forced to confront its own shortcomings. And the customers, especially the ones who had been dismissed, ignored, made to feel like they didn't belong, they noticed the change. Victoria, however, never forgot that day. The ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, her inbox overflowed. Messages poured in, customers sharing their stories, their own experiences of being doubted, overlooked, excluded. Employees reached out too, some thanking her, others revealing that they had witnessed the same patterns of bias but had felt powerless to challenge them. Some had been denied loans they qualified for. Others had been treated with quiet condescension, their concerns dismissed before they had even finished speaking. The incident became more than just a moment of confrontation. It became a catalyst for something bigger. Victoria didn't just walk away from that experience, she carried it forward. She used it to shape new initiatives, ones that would ensure that no customer, no matter how they looked or spoke or dressed, would ever have to question whether they belonged. Because real change doesn't happen with a single policy update. It doesn't happen with corporate mission statements or carefully crafted press releases. It happens when someone refuses to accept the status quo. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong? Have you ever stepped into a space, one where you should have been treated with dignity and respect, only to be met with skepticism, scrutiny, or outright dismissal? Have you ever watched someone else be treated unfairly and wondered whether you should speak up? Have you ever questioned yourself, wondering if what you felt was real or if you were just imagining it? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They are the reason these conversations matter. They are the foundation of why standing up against injustice isn't just a moral choice. It's a necessity. Key lessons from Victoria's story. Victoria's experience was more than a personal battle. It was a stark reflection of the everyday struggles that countless people endure. judged not by their qualifications, their achievements, or their integrity, but by the assumptions others place upon them. This is not just a story, it is a wake-up call. Even in institutions that claim to value equality, bias, both conscious and unconscious, thrives when left unchallenged, and words, no matter how well intended, are not enough. Change demands action. It requires courage. It demands accountability. 1. Perception shapes experience. How people see us dictates how they treat us. Victoria, despite being the CEO of the very bank she stood in, was seen as someone who didn't belong. Why? Because she didn't fit the image of power and success that they had in their minds. This moment was a reminder, or an infuriating but necessary one, that bias still holds weight in society. 2. Power lies in taking a stand. Victoria could have left that bank in silence. She could have walked away, shaken her head, and added this experience to the long list of injustices that go unchallenged. But she didn't. She stood her ground. And in doing so, she forced a system that had become comfortable in its biases to reckon with its flaws. Real change happens when we refuse to stay silent. 3. Institutional change requires accountability. This wasn't just about Todd. It wasn't just about one employee's decision to press a button. It was about a culture, one that had allowed this type of discrimination to exist in the first place. Victoria didn't just demand justice for herself. She made sure the entire institution changed so that no one else would have to endure what she did. That is what leadership looks like. 4. Every customer deserves equal treatment. How is it that some people walk into a bank and are greeted with warm smiles and effortless transactions, while others are met with hesitation, scrutiny, or outright denial? It's not a coincidence, and it's not okay. Every business, every institution must take a hard look at its practices and ask, are we serving everyone equally, or only those who fit an unspoken mold? 5. Speak up. Your voice has power. If Victoria had said nothing, what would have changed? Nothing. But by speaking up, she not only reclaimed her authority, she ignited a movement within her own company. And more than that, she inspired others to speak. Her story serves as a reminder. When we witness injustice, when we experience it firsthand, our voices matter. A message to you. Have you ever been treated differently, judged for how you look, how you dress, how you speak? Have you ever watched someone else be dismissed unfairly? If you feel comfortable, share your story in the comments. Your voice can help bring awareness. Your experience can inspire change. Let's keep these conversations going because they matter, because you matter. If you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because together we are stronger, and together we can create real change.